Chapter 1. Early days. Since I have had a life in aviation, it is appropriate to start with my takeoff, which happened at Queen Charlotte's Hospital in Marylebone, London at 7:30 p.m. approximately on the 6th of December, 1922. I was born very much in my mother's change of life. She was in fact 47 years of age. Indeed an afterthought. We lived in Kensington, in London, and my sisters, 9 and 10 years old, I gather, were pleased over the event, but not so my brother, 7 years older, who was not at all taken with the competition from the new baby. Before I was 6 months old he, apparently, showed his displeasure by cracking me over the head with a powder box. To many people this explains a lot. Fortunately, the damage was not lasting as far as I know. I think I can truly say that I am a product of Great Britain, for my father was half English and half Welsh, came from Warwickshire and of more humble stock. My mother, on the other hand, half Irish and half Scottish, was an aristocrat born to wealth and position, whose family name, Fitzsimmons, was descended from the Irish kings. My mother had been educated at home by a German governess with all the benefits of that type of privileged status. I was named after my grandfather on my mother's side, George, who came from Belfast and a family and seafarers. I am very proud of my Irish lineage, and it played a part in my life in the R.A.F. many years later. My father and mother met when he was stationed with the British Army in Cork and Era. By the time I appeared on the scene, the family had suffered many heavy losses of funds and were quite poor. Prior to this, the family had been comfortably off, and my brother and sisters had been brought up in an elegant house and nurtured by a nanny. Like all of us, our early childhood is a series of cameos, somewhat vague in memory, but nevertheless stamping a lasting impression, which I think is portent for the future character of any individual. My first memories started at the ages of between 3 and 5 years. After a year in Kensington we moved to Brighton on the Sussex coast. However, one incident in Kensington, which I don't recall, but my sisters do, may explain my youthful attitude to life. We lived near Kensington Gardens in London, where J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan statue stands as a symbol of eternal childhood. On one occasion my sisters took me out for a walk in my pram but left me by the Peter Pan statue, arriving home without me. Something may have rubbed off, but considerable consternation was caused in the house until my pram and I were recovered. My early memories all occur in Brighton, and I have tried to equate them to my interests and attitudes to life. I was chucked into the sea by my brother and sisters to get me to swim. I still remember that fright. I think it left me with lasting respect for the sea and its power. Another early memory is when I was taken to see the then Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII, visiting Brighton, an important event that was not to be missed. He was a popular figure, good-looking, debonair, and admired for having fought in the Great War, at the front line for long periods, not just for visits. I remember the big car and the waving and cheering as the prince drove past. I think this began my interest and love of the royal family, which has lasted me all my life. Present events sadden me greatly, but I firmly believe the monarchy will survive. I also remember being given a box of chocolates with a picture of King George V on it, and that impressed me, the photo as well as the chocolates. My early memories are punctuated with many impressions, one of many men on crutches from the loss of legs in the war. A war which was very much in people's minds, as it was only 4 years since the armistice. A ship in distress off Brighton in a violent storm is another memory, when I got out of bed on one dark stormy night to look at the distress flares going up. Again strengthening in my respect of the sea. All the talk of the horrors of the Great War may also have left a very sad impression on the folly of the horrendous war. Two final impressions of those early years are my love of animals and my favorite walks to a chicken farm where I would deliver letters, scribble, I had already written. This gave me the feeling that I was communicating with them. In those days there were no cruel hand batteries, but a field of clucking birds pecking their way around the grass. I would imitate them and they would all come to the fence, which I recall with pleasure. Animals were everywhere in those days with so many horse-drawn vehicles about, and this helped me to grow up to love all animals. Another memory was when Woolworths opened its first store in Brighton. When it really was the 3-penny and 6-penny store. Hordes of people passed carrying all sorts of utensils and goods from the opening sale, all chattering about their purchases as they went past. So the first 5 years passed and we then moved back to London, leaving me with the early childhood memories and impressions, which as mentioned earlier played a great part in my later childhood and in fact all my life. In 1927, when we moved from Brighton to London where my father had obtained work, I was still only 5, but I do remember my first day at school near King's Cross. We lived in Argyle Square with a residence garden in the centre of the square, so typical of many in London. What made starting school an especially nervous experience was that I was in a new district where I had not yet made friends. Everyone and everything was strange and unknown, thereby leaving an indelible imprint on my memory, not necessarily a happy one. We moved several times before settling in North London, which, as a result, I experienced indifferent schooling. Home life was rather scary at times as my father and mother quarreled a lot, but my sisters and brother seemed to take my mother's side. My mother was a slightly built frail person and was often unwell, a condition which developed a dread in me that I might lose her. She was a cultured lady speaking beautiful English. She read to me regularly every day, which helped me to read very early in life and to speak well. Her influence on my attitudes was profound. One highlight of my life was when my father bought a fox terrier pup home for me. I can see her now and fell in love with her at once. We called her Trixie and she slept with me and became my constant companion. Taking her for regular walks furthered this relationship and strengthened my inbred love of animals. We were an animal-mad family anyway, for my mother would always look after stray cats. Incredulously, we had up to 30 cats and kittens under care at one time. As a balance, my brother had cages of mice with a total of 70 before he took them or turned the house into a menagerie. One great joy each year was to go to the annual horse cart parade in Regent's Park. Prizes were offered in various classes of carts and horses, and the turnout of those days was very large, since half of all transport was still horse and cart. After judging and the award of prizes, the whole parade trotted past from ponies and carts to Clydesdales pulling brewers' drays, a truly magnificent sight. The Cockney kings and queens in their pearly suits were all there and it was a truly memorable occasion. We were so used to having goods delivered by horse-drawn carts that keen gardeners kept a bucket and spade handy, especially those living in side streets, so they could pick up a regular supply of manure. It also kept the streets clean. My father loved sport and encouraged my interest in all games. I remember our first radio, a cat whisker crystal set, and my father handed me the headphones to listen to commentary on the England v Australia test, when Don Bradman scored one of his many test centuries as he blazed across the cricket world. My sporting interest became paramount and I grew strong and fit, although rather thin. We lived near to where the Arsenal Football Club played and their captain, Tom Parker, had a greengrocer's shop nearby. I remember a Saturday in 1930 when Arsenal played Huddersfield in the cup final at Wembley Stadium. Parker's shop and many others were bedecked with banners and posters. Arsenal won 2-0 and this started my lifetime support of the great Arsenal team. Early on I was taken to see them play and this started me off to go to the ground whenever I could. In those days the crowds were very large and 60,000-70,000 at Highbury were quite normal. When the crowd started to press, men passed us youngsters over the heads of the crowd on a sea of hands down to the front and safely onto the sidelines. Arsenal had their great run in the 30s, winning 5 league titles and the FA Cup twice. It was a thrilling record for a young boy to be inspired by, and indeed I was. I also spent many free hours collecting Arsenal players' autographs, including the great Alex James, a football legend. Dennis Compton of football and cricket fame was then a young club apprentice used to help us get autographs, by letting us know who was coming out and when. One could not describe me as academic by any stretch of the imagination, but, encouraged by my teachers, I developed a great interest in current affairs and politics. I grew up in the era of political upheaval, the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and their equivalent leader in Britain, Sir Oswald Mosley, who was the head of the British Fascist Party. I started out at an early age to go to public meetings mainly to watch the punch-ups that followed between fascists and communists. Violence and frequent charges by mounted police were quite a regular occurrence. 2 particularly nasty incidents occurred at meetings, one at the Royal Albert Hall where a large fascist meeting was being held. Communists climbed on the roof, which was largely glass, smashing the panes so they fell down on the crowd below, causing many to receive serious injuries. At another meeting, a potato was thrown with razor blades planted in it, and this took out the eye of one of the young lady fascist supporters. Who says political violence is new? However, despite my limited academic prowess, I won a prize for literature. My proudest moment was when I won sixpence, the headmaster's prize, for reciting Shakespeare's King Henry V's speech before Agincourt. We were very poor in those days, and my father, like many others, was on the dole, the fate of many families in the Great Depression years. I can remember clutching the sixpence and running home to give it to my mother. In those days it would buy our family meal. What sticks in my mind is that it was the first time I had been completely determined to win a prize, and sat up late in bed reciting the poem over and over again. This early success was significant, for I always remembered it when I really wanted to succeed, and this memory fired my determination. I loved sport and being outdoors, often spending hours just kicking balls around. My sporting success came through a similar determination when I won the school athletics competition in 1936, the year I had to leave school at 14 years of age. I won the 100, 220, and 440 yards races and the hurdles, all on one afternoon. My schooling had to end at the earliest leaving age, because there was no way my family could financially support further schooling, and I was not academically good enough to win a scholarship to further my schooling. One had to be very clever indeed to win scholarships in the 1930s in London. Consequently, schooling for me came to an abrupt end. I also learned to cook, as my mother was often unwell. We could not afford to have my brothers and sisters off work in those days, as there was no sick pay. So it was easier to keep me off school to cook meals for the family, under my mother's directions from her sick bed. I did not realize then, but later in life, the ability to do housework and cook would be very necessary, due to my wife's ill health. My first job was in the library, book and music shop, where I worked for an avid socialist and peace activist named Hubert. Although he never converted me from conservative and right-wing views, he played a great part in my education. He gave me many books to read by good authors, and taught me to appreciate good music. I also met many varied and interesting people in the course of my work. My pay was 7 shillings and sixpence per week, a week being full-time Monday to Saturday, except for half-day Wednesday. My duties involved traveling to London music and book publishers to collect book and music orders, a very interesting side of my job. I got to know my way around London very well indeed. Most of my travel was on my own bicycle, and cycling became a great relaxation for me. It was a great deal safer to ride around on bikes in those days. On my time off in summer, I would cycle up to 100 miles a day, traveling the highways and byways of England. One of my favorite days out was to cycle to Windsor and Eton. I loved the River Thames and the castle, soldiers, and the serenity of the grounds and buildings of Eton School. How I wished for that sort of education, so far beyond my reach. During those formative years, certain patterns of life are revealed. My school days had ended at the age of 14 with no more than the normal school leaving certificate and various certificates for literature. My success had been as the school athletics champion, plus all the swimming certificates attainable at the time, but soccer and cricket were my great loves in sport. Throughout the following few years, my interests were to show a more of a specific nature, involving mostly sport and aviation. Interest in girls was of a passing nature only, although 2 girls did have some interest for me, one when I was 16. By the name of Ruth, of whom I was thinking of having a more steady involvement, but this was to come to a tragic end. The following day after I last saw her, I read in the newspaper, to my horror, that she had been killed the night before, having been hit by a car when crossing the road. A terrible end to a young life. My only other involvement during those years was with a girl named Eileen Scott. Whilst we did not go out quite often together, it was mainly in the company of others. Unfortunately, Eileen's father was a leading trade unionist and dedicated member of the British Communist Party, which was a complete anathema to me. Most of the evenings ended in strong political argument, especially with my right-wing leanings and conservatism. After the war, her father eventually became the head of the Communist Party in Britain, Hardly a suitable association for a career R.A.F. officer. By the time I was 14, both my sisters had married and only my brother and I were at home. When I was almost 16 we moved to East Barnet and I changed my job to become an apprentice engineer at the Standard Telephone and Cables factory at Southgate. We actually lived next door to the factory's sports grounds, a situation I was going to take great advantage of right up until the beginning of the war. Sport being the recreation I followed with most enthusiasm, playing cricket in the summer, soccer in the winter. I was also taught to box by the former lightweight champion of Great Britain Sam Stewart. Sam was an interesting person with a very gentle nature and a marvelous person for boys of my age to be with, because of the very high standards of sportsmanship he set. He had been the last boxer to fight a national championship of 20 rounds and the first boxer to take part in a BBC broadcast fight. My thoughts about boxing were, and still are, that it is a great sport as training, but not in actually fighting and getting smashed up. The type of training is superb for a young lad because it is so good for getting extremely fit and also bodybuilding. I found it helped me tremendously with the many other sports I took part in, and by the high standard of fitness it developed. I am sure that this early emphasis on sport had been a major reason that I am still very fit at 70 years of age. One of my prime interests was to spend a day at Lord's watching cricket, and in those days I was able to see the great men perform. I saw players like Hammond, Larwood, Compton and Bradman and the exciting West Indian Leary Constantine all play in matches at Lord's. I think those were the vintage years of cricket, when sportsmanship on the field, and off, was of prime importance, which made the players of those years wonderful examples to follow. I don't think this is always the case now when money and winning at all costs are the paramount aims, generally to the detriment of the game itself. And certainly to sporting attitudes. One strong interest started to develop during the period of which I write in seemed to come almost unobtrusively, namely aviation. One will remember that these days were the pioneering days of aviation and our superstars were the Gene Battens, the Mollisons, Lindbergh and the like. I remember also seeing the great airships when they flew over London. Graf Zeppelin, Hindenburg, and Britain's R100 and R101. These were certainly awe-inspiring machines to see when airborne and captured my imagination. But R101 was the climax of Britain's airship activity when tragically she was lost on a flight from England to India in 1933. I vividly remember my father getting me out of bed the night that R101 flew over London on its voyage to India. It was all lit up and a beautiful sight to behold. The next morning my father came into my bedroom with the Sunday newspaper telling me the story that the R101 had crashed in Bordeaux during a storm. A few days later a state funeral was held for the 48 victims and I was taken to see it. The strains of Chopin's funeral march poignantly playing as the sad procession moved through the streets of London. After this tragedy Britain abandoned its airship project. The R100 was broken down to scrap. My father had a wartime colleague who was a senior engineer with Imperial Airways at Croydon Airport, one Archie Strong. And I was taken to Croydon and given a tour of the airport facilities and the aircraft by Archie. This so impressed me that I became greatly interested in aviation to the extent that I immediately started a scrapbook covering all aviation events. I also went several years running to see the famous Royal Air Force Hendon Air Display, an annual event. On one other occasion I was out with my father in his car when we came across Alan Cobham's Air Circus performing at Elstree Airfield north of London. My father could not stop but gave me the entrance money and instructions on how to get home on public transport, so I stayed and watched the barnstorming display. Joy rides could be had for 5 shillings, but unfortunately my funds did not stretch to that and I watched those that could go on those flights green with envy. All those aviation events weaved a pattern through my formative years and had a great bearing on my following life in aviation for over 50 years, but more of that later. I had always had a desire to follow a life in the services but had been inclined towards serving in the army, through watching the ceremonial parades. Daily events in London had stimulated that wish. In 1937 my father arranged for me to go and stay with some friends of his in the south coast of Sussex and right next door to the Portsmouth Naval Base. I was very keen to do some rowing, and during this holiday I daily hired a boat and rowed myself round to vantage points outside Portsmouth Harbour. My interest in rowing arose from having regularly watched the Oxford and Cambridge boat race crews and training on the River Thames. Those were the days of the great capital battleships, and one vivid memory was to be close to HMS Warspite when she went on her first trial sailing after a £3 million refit. As she glided past the point where I was, she made a majestic sight. It's interesting to think that the cost of her refit in those days would hardly buy a small part of a modern aircraft carrier or the like. This holiday influenced me to become very interested in the Navy, and I then decided that at the appropriate time I would go into the services, and in all probability the Navy. This fact would have a particular significance later on when I actually joined the services in 1940. The year 1938 was a watershed for Europe and for me, as the political climate changed dramatically following the Munich crisis. After World War I, UK general strike of 1926 and the Great Depression years in the late 1920s and early 1930s, things begin to improve. From about 1933 the UK economy improved, bringing more jobs and more spending money. Coupled with this improvement on life in the UK for its citizens, were spectacular advantages in technology. Huge strides were made in communications, by radio and TV, the latter in its infancy and only enjoyed by the wealthy and privileged few. The era was the period of the great days of Hollywood and the cinema. Most people went to the cinema at least once a week and enjoyed the glitter and the stars of the magic screen. Greta Garbo, and the Barrymores, Clark Gable, Betty Grable, Astaire and Rogers all captivated cinema goers. There were also great advances in transportation, in both land and sea, and aviation began to evolve as a major means of world transport. People could take holidays, and enjoy many sports and outside activities. It was the era of speed records, on land, sea and in the air. The heroes of the day were the men and women who broke them. The political upheavals in Europe inspired by Hitler and Mussolini threatened the future, but which the British at large chose to ignore. After all, why should we worry? We had the English Channel and all was well. 1935 saw the silver jubilee of King George V and Queen Mary. With all the pomp and ceremony of such a celebration for a beloved royal family. I remember going to see 2 of the tours of London districts undertaken by the King and Queen. On one occasion I was among 70,000 schoolchildren assembled in the mall to welcome the royal couple, a memorable event. Sadly, in January 1936, King George V died and King Edward VIII ascended to the throne. Little did we know that he would abdicate in December that year. So in 1 year we had 3 monarchs, King George V, King Edward VIII and King George VI. I went to see 3 trooping the colour parades, 1935, 1936 and 1937. Each year the parade being held by a different monarch. Incidentally, the next time I went to the ceremony was in 1957 and again a different monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. Surely, it was a unique record to see the ceremony 4 times and each time a new king or queen. The abdication was a real blow to the prestige of the royal family, and talk then was of the ability of the British monarchy to survive. I have recalled this previous doubt as it raises its head again this year, with the breakup of 3 royal marriages in 1992. I am confident that the monarchy in Britain will last many more years. Earlier I wrote of 1938 being a watershed in my life, and this is how it came about. Slowly, but surely the actions of the 2 dictators could no longer be ignored, namely Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia and Hitler's invasions of the demilitarized Rhineland, the Saar, and Czechoslovakian Sudetenland. The problem came to a head when Hitler, without warning, marched into Czechoslovakia. This gave rise to what was called the Munich crisis. Prime Ministers Chamberlain of Britain and Daladier of France meet Hitler and Mussolini and concluded a treaty with Hitler, which allowed him to overrun the remainder of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a guarantee of peace and promise of no further invasions of other European countries. Neville Chamberlain returned to Britain in triumph, waving his so-called piece of paper which he declared, "will give us peace in our time." These words came to be a joke, and the only thing the appeasement of Hitler did was to give Britain, in the event, a chance to build up its defenses against future possible attack. What all these events did for me personally was to make me feel that nothing would ever be the same again, as the inevitability of war began to emerge. Although, life went on much the same as I worked at a factory and played my various sports. The main sporting emphasis was in athletics, where I had been chosen as a potential national champion runner. Two men, Fred Ambler and Bart Bartholomew, both British Amateur Athletic Association champions, coached me. Fred as a cross-country specialist and Bart as a sprint champion. Apart from winning a few races, it all came to naught in the long run. Due to the outbreak of war, my peace of mind was no longer as easy as it was before the Munich crisis. The 3rd of September, 1939, and the outbreak of World War II changed everything and how.